What about the problem of innocent suffering in the world? Well, in dealing with this problem, I think it's vitally important that we distinguish between what I would call the emotional problem of suffering and the intellectual problem of suffering. Pain and suffering, watching a child suffer, is certainly, I think, a major emotional obstacle to believing in God. But however emotionally difficult suffering makes it to believe in God, I'm convinced that this is not a good intellectual objection to God's existence. Why? Well, first of all, it is not at all clear that if God exists, it's not at all clear that the suffering in the world is truly pointless. You see, we're simply not in a good position to make those kind of probability judgments. When we observe any instance of suffering in our lives, we have really no idea what God's morally sufficient reasons might be. William Alston lists 6 limitations on us which make it impossible for us to judge that God has no good reason to permit suffering in our lives. Take just one, our being limited in time and space. We have only a narrow window upon time and space, but God orders the end of history from the beginning, and his morally sufficient reasons for permitting some instance of suffering to enter our lives might not emerge until centuries later, maybe in another country. Just because in our narrow framework we don't see the reason for its occurring doesn't mean that there isn't a reason for its occurring in God's wider framework. And thus Alston concludes it is in principle impossible for us to be justified in supposing that God does not have sufficient reasons for permitting evil. Now Austin Dacey anticipated this response and says, but then why doesn't God tell us why we suffer? Tell us the reason. Well, number one, he has told us. In the Bible, it tells us this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Now, whether or not God's purposes in allowing our suffering are achieved all depends upon our response. Do you respond with anger and bitterness and hatred toward God, or do you respond toward what you suffer with dependence and courage and trust in God? Now, Austin might say, well, why doesn't God get more specific than just this sort of general statement? Well, notice that would turn the universe, first of all, into a haunted house. God would whisper, the reason you just fell down the stairs and broke your ankle is because 75 years from now, I'm going to have someone in Catalan, Mexico, who will greatly benefit from the effects of this event. Well, that would just turn the universe into a sort of haunted house, I think, which is absurd. Secondly, it might not do any good. Even if God told people why they were being allowed to suffer, they still might resent God just as much as they do when they don't know the reason. So I don't see that God's under any obligation to tell us more specifically. Thirdly, it might be logically impossible for God to tell us the reason, because if he did, then people might not act in the same way. They might act differently so that God's morally sufficient reason wouldn't transpire or come about. And thus it may well be logically impossible for God to tell us specifically. What he has done is he told us generally that we can trust him. He's given good evidence of his existence so that we can trust him as we go through the valley of suffering, confident that when we come out, there awaits us in heaven an eternal reward that is far, far beyond, immeasurably beyond anything that we suffered in this life, so that when we look back, we would say, I'd go through it a million times over to know this joy and this happiness. And therefore, I don't think any of these arguments present compelling reasons for thinking that God does not exist.
Dr. Dacey, you have the next 12 minutes.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Craig's first argument said that theism provides the best explanation for why there's something rather than nothing, why the universe exists at all. But I'm a bit puzzled by his use of the Big Bang as empirical confirmation of the claim that the universe began to exist out of nothing. That's not how many mainstream physicists would characterize it. Brian Greene, professor of physics and mathematics at Columbia University, writes in his latest book, The Fabric of the Cosmos, quote, "A common misconception is that the Big Bang provides a theory of cosmic origins. It doesn't. The Big Bang is a theory that delineates cosmic evolution from a split second after whatever happened to bring the universe into existence. But it says nothing at all about time zero itself. And since, according to the Big Bang theory, the bang is what is supposed to have happened at the beginning, the Big Bang leaves out the bang. It tells us nothing about what banged, why it banged, how it banged," end quote. Well, as physicists trace the expansion of the universe backwards in time, they reach a point at which current theory just breaks down. Many cosmologists think that a full account will await a new insight that will synthesize Einstein's relativity theory with quantum mechanics, the theory that talks about the behavior of very, very small systems, like the initial singularity at the beginning of the universe. There are many contenders for such a unified theory, but no clear victors as of yet. In 2002, the National Research Council issued a report detailing 11 unanswered questions in physics and astronomy, and one of them is, how did the universe begin? So I think it's fair to conclude that our scientific knowledge of the origins of the universe is just nowhere near complete. Therefore, it would be premature to use it as a premise in an ambitious theological argument such as Craig's. Now, as to the argument from fine-tuning, the fine-tuning of the universe would imply theism only if we knew that the life-permitting values of the fundamental constants are brute facts, things that won't be explained by any further, deeper physical laws that we'll discover. However, there's no consensus in physics about this either. According to Sir Martin Rees, former director of Cambridge University's Institute of Astronomy, quote, "The status and scope of anthropic arguments in the long run will depend on the character of the still quite unknown laws at the very deepest level. Steven Weinberg hopes that a, quote, final theory exists and that we may someday discover it. What we call the fundamental constants may be secondary consequences of this final theory, rather than direct manifestations of its deepest and most fundamental level. Consider, for instance, the cosmological constant. Will the final theory offer some deep reason why this has to be exactly zero? Or is its value an accident? We just don't know," end quote. Again, Craig is trying to base a sweeping metaphysical conclusion on a highly speculative, unfinished frontier of an advancing science. I think it's simply too soon to say whether there can be no naturalistic, non-theistic explanation of cosmic fine-tuning. And note that the history of science gives us some reason to hope that there will be. Don't forget that 150 years ago, the adaptiveness of organisms to their environment was thought of as a kind of fine-tuning that only a loving creator could explain. But thanks to Darwinian natural selection theory, we now know that it's not necessarily to invoke that. In any case, the postulation of a transcendent cause of the cosmos would be unsatisfactory as an explanation. This is because it presupposes a radically new and mysterious kind of causation. The causes that we know about, for one thing, precede their effects in time. By contrast, God's creative actions are supposed not to precede their effects in time because he transcends time. Craig asked, how could a timeless cause give rise to a temporal effect? And he answers that the timeless cause must be a person. But whatever could that mean, a person who acts timelessly? Persons as we know them, as we are them, we do things in time. I mean, some of us are more on time than others, but we act in time. Furthermore, causation as we know it involves the rearrangement of pre-existing matter, as when you create a sandcastle by rearranging pre-existing sand on a beach. God's creative action produces its effect out of nothing at all. Think about that. Creating out of nothing at all. If he wants theism to make sense of the origins of the universe, then I think Craig owes us at least a rough sketch of how this radically new kind of causation is supposed to work.